So, yeah, narrative and digital art, the pregnant moment in VR. I guess I'm kind of using this kind of term, pregnant moment, as a kind of a concept really from theories that are typically applied within visual art. And, you know, they essentially work very well in terms of how they can be transferred, let's say, between, you know, painting or digital media, but they're also kind of restrictive, you know, as, you know, theories that can be useful to kind of look at, you know, what happens around an artwork, which is often the concern that a lot of people have when they're kind of working with contemporary digital work. So, so I suppose the title itself is a bit kind of tongue-in-cheek. I don't know to what extent it requires an explanation. It's pretty ubiquitous in terms of how it's applied within art criticism, art history, media studies, and narratology. And I've kind of listed a couple of references there that I found very useful in kind of unpacking the idea of the pregnant moment in visual art. I think in terms of an important use of the term, we can go back as far as Lessing, and we can see a quotation there: the pregnant moment is most likely to contain forces that can be continued in the imagination of the spectator. In visual art, therefore, a covert narrative force is always present. I really kind of like this quote in the sense that it kind of underlines, on the one hand, kind of a feeling that I have that narrative is always floating around there somewhere where you've got human beings in the mix. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily come to the surface until there's some engagement, either between people or between people and artefacts. And increasingly, I suppose, with digital art, there is that kind of conversational engagement with you know, art. You know, we're sort of living in an age of sort of interactive media and artificial intelligence. So, you know, this is kind of something that's becoming, you know, sort of more prominent, I suppose, in the way people might think about their engagement with works. So I suppose this is an example, I suppose, of a prototypical example of sort of what I'm referring to, or what others have referred to as a pregnant moment. It's the idea that an image is kind of loaded with possibilities that encourage, let's say, the spectator to kind of go backwards in time and imagine events that led up to the situation that's been described in the image, but also provides the opportunity to think forward to the subsequent consequences of maybe what's been described in that same image. So this idea really is kind of something that's been spoken about at length in relation to history painting, you know, particularly history painting and painting really since the High Renaissance on. So where work is representational or figurative. So it's a very flexible concept. Like a lot of concepts, let's say, you know, that are regarded, I suppose, as mainstream concepts or orthodox theories that can be applied within visual art. But I think one of the problems that we have when we're dealing with digital art, and I think it's underlined by people like Claire Bishop and Grant H. Kester in a much more wider scope in relation to art in general, is that it can be a little bit insufficient really in terms of describing how a narrative operates, particularly in relation to works that are interactive, participative, or are driven by artificial intelligence, or require people to be pushed around the place in a sense kind of by the artwork. So in other words, they become part of the material of the art itself. And I suppose, observation on their behalf that sort of the theories that we reach for in order to explain what's going on in these artworks really demands a methodology that is on some ground sociological. So this was kind of the basis of kind of research that I did previously. I was very much interested in, you know, the social spaces around art. So a lot of those kind of, let's say, orthodox theories, or, you know, narrative theories did a great job in explaining what was going on within an artifact. But when you start to kind of looking at the social spaces as you move back from the artifact, the interactions between people within museums or art galleries, or the way in which, let's say, a digital artwork may force people into certain behaviours. A lot of these kind of orthodox theories really didn't do a great job in terms of explaining what was going on. So I suppose part of my research was kind of looking at what additional territory could be brought in, from sociology and from the cognitive sciences to help explain what artists were doing when they were creating digital interactive artworks. So I might kind of just try and anchor that a little bit and kind of, sort of a bit of a run through in terms of works that I did from an early point in time into, just pointing to some examples of work that is currently being developed at the moment. So I kind of would have originally done a lot of work with photography. It's quite small there, but I think in the context of works like this, they tended to be organized into sequences. They tended to use cinematic language. Camera angles were kind of Hitchcockian in this particular case, and that idea of sort of using that cinematic language, to kind of point towards narrative. The time that I was making these, I really wasn't talking about narrative. I was more interested in cinema and how the language could be transferred between still images and, let's say, time-based information. So a lot of the kind of works were organized in sequences, but even in cases where there were kind of standalone works, a lot of those kind of orthodox theories did a great job explaining what was going on, in works that were even more sculptural, but like in the visual photographic media that was being employed, it was still kind of, driven by kind of lighting that was quite theatrical, and all these scenes were really staged to be captured in, a split moment when the shutter release, on the camera was active. When I kind of moved into kind of working with digital photography or digital processes, that whole process changed. So to some degree, this is stuff really from the kind of late 90s, really mid to late 90s. These were kind of works that I don't really like anymore, but I think they do serve to provide an example of the way in which, the way that I made use of a camera, for example, was more about collecting data, storing that data, and then, getting it digitized at some point and then mixing it up then into these kind of narrative scenarios. Appeared to be kind of staged, but at the same time, the process in the background was very much closer to really painting. So when I was doing my master's, this was the kind of correlation I was starting to make more explicitly with narrative. The idea that these images look like photographs, but again, this is work from around about 99 to 2000, 2001. I was also kind of using process where I was simulating certain things, certain content, and mashing that in, mixing it in then with images that I had taken in order for these images to look as if they were taken in a split moment. But again, these processes were very much kind of more like drawing, I suppose, as opposed to, let's say, photography as a process. And again, I was reaching towards concepts within early pre-Renaissance painting, for example, among other things, where strategies that painters used to organize, let's say, events into boxes, through, architecture or through paneling, was a way in which sort of events could be connected together, but at the same time segregated in terms of their contribution to a story. And again, a lot of that stuff is kind of built on biblical narratives that, at the time that were already available to people. I suppose there were extrinsic stories that the works were in some ways kind of re-showing or retelling. So in that way, sort of when I became sort of more conscious that I was kind of dealing with narrative, and somehow that kind of impacted the way in which I was actually working. So in the case of some of these images here, I'm not sure if they're that clear in the projection, but these were kind of looking at sort of the relationship between mythology and landscape. And I thought some of the presentations earlier were really good in terms of when you're kind of, dealing with governments and when you're kind of dealing with big business. It's kind of interesting to see the way the kind of material landscape can be described in different ways. So a lot of this work was kind of looking at the way mythology in relation to the Irish landscape would be described by somebody like the Irish Tourist Board. Like if you went for a walk in these hills, you'd expect to bump into a few guys from the Tuatha Dé Danann. Whereas, on the other hand, big businesses that were submitting environmental impact assessments, where the reuse of the land under government policy meant that there was going to be an introduction of new technologies and new structures into these places that kind of negated the mythology associated with them. That association was very much played down in environmental impact assessments that were associated with those planning decisions. So again, like the narrative in this case is more topical rather than necessarily being to do with the language of the works themselves in terms of they're not particularly cinematic. All of these kind of landscapes now have, are peppered, let's say, with various different structures, data centers, wind farms and solar farms. So in a sense, kind of a lot of these works are kind of romantic in some ways in their style. They're intentionally that in order to kind of reflect these wider narratives about the Irish landscape that are told by other agents elsewhere. So, and then I suppose in terms of work that I was doing commercially in around this time, I was doing quite a bit of programming as well. My introduction to, let's say, Photoshop, for example, was through commercial work that I was doing. So I was introducing some of that kind of knowledge back into developing works. And in this case, Tween was a kind of a web-based work where there was a front end where you could upload information into a database, images into a database that were categorized around narrative concepts like, categories such as the world, character and action. And then scripts were written, server-side scripts were written in order to sample those images out of the database and then combine them then into these images, which again were automatically written by the system, but again became quite strong in terms of narrative. So bringing together images that were never intended to be displayed simultaneously, but by doing so every so often you got an image that looked okay and was loaded with narrative possibilities. So there again, sort of, showing how that sort of orthodox concept of a pregnant moment can move across different media. And again, that same process would have been used in a number of kind of different works. So again, this idea of a family portrait where images of a family were taken, fed into a system and then pixel sampled from those images in order to create a generic portrait of the family, not specific members, but kind of almost kind of an average portrait of everybody, in the family. I still like these images. They kind of remind me of kind of people sitting for paintings or portraits. They're very static. But again, sort of it's the software that's kind of generating these. And again, this would have been work that was kind of around about 2008. And then I did a lot of collaboration, I suppose, with different artists as well. I worked with Mark Cullen. I think he had something in this last year or the year before. And again, sort of, there was a story kind of about that kind of sculpture that helped him develop the design of his sculptures, which we shared. And then essentially I was involved in kind of developing the technologies that went into the belly of the sculpture that controlled or, let's say, made the sculpture, I guess, aware what people were doing around it, their proximity to it. When they came within a certain range, there was face tracking capture system that was activated, and when people were in the perfect position, they were photographed. Their image then sort of blended with people that had visited the exhibition on previous occasions. So in this way, kind of here's a point about sort of where the work is starting to become concerned about not necessarily the aesthetic of the artwork itself, but really what people are actually doing around the artwork. That's becoming part of the aesthetic of the interaction. I also kind of did work at Blackrock Castle. They were studying quasars, the energy that gets expelled out of a black hole. They were kind of looking to kind of figure out systems for measuring that in some way. They gave me access to all their data, and then I kind of wrote an application to sample data from those studies and use it as a driver for the audio track for a 3D animation, which was like an 11-minute loop. And I guess up to this point, a lot of the work was really, it was art. It was being presented within art galleries. And essentially, that was the space that it was intended for. And then subsequent to that, then sort of, I started kind of looking at sort of areas in HCI where sort of I'd produce art, but I'd put it into kind of spaces to see how it would impact what people would do within those spaces. So again, kind of, there were kind of systems that kind of used, video tracking to find out where people were in front of an artwork. When they stopped in front of the artwork, then a narrative would explode, let's say, on the screen. Would they stay and look at that, or would they move on? So there was a number of places where I kind of started exploring ideas like that, and sort of locally here across the river, Cork City Jail were brilliant, giving me access to the space where I hid artworks in locations where people would stumble upon them. And this was kind of in response to an observation that people tended to lose interest in the audio trail that they were using after around about 15 minutes and started looking at the architecture and exploring aspects of the architecture that normally they wouldn't. So when they came upon something, I kind of wrote a system using software PD that enabled me to record sort of what they said verbally when they came across these things, and then I conducted some observations in terms of how their movement around the space differed from what people would normally do. So again, this was kind of really kind of saying something about, let's say, how the art affects what people do, and kind of gives you kind of data where it helps you kind of design. So I kind of was involved in the development of Nanonagle Place as well, where we were looking to establish some design principles or heuristics for the exhibition and for the overall space. And surprisingly, narrative kind of came up in that process as well. So just in terms of the work that I'm doing at the moment, I'm collaborating with a couple of people. So I'm still doing a bit of work with Mark Cullen up in Dublin. I'm also working with Thomas Madachak in Skibbereen in West Cork. Thomas has an interest in the Irish-speaking traditions on Cape Clear. I'm particularly looking at, let's say, an area in Muskerry Gaeltacht where I live, where recently Pádraig Ó Céilleachair published a book on oral accounts that were collected from people in the early 1940s. These accounts are actually indexed to specific townlands in the area. So you can go to those places and you can kind of correlate what was actually accounted for in the oral statements and sort of find the actual locations where these stories were, located. And I started using that then sort of as a way of kind of building assets for a VR sort of, experience, I suppose, which is cinematic. So it's going back to that kind of earlier kind of work that I would have done in photography, where you place people into a VR environment, but you don't give them very much to do. You allow them to be there and then to sort of involve them, let's say, in a way where they, are triggered, let's say, by potential narratives that might emerge in their own thinking as a result of being there. So I suppose that kind of, to some degree, kind of explains the title of the presentation in the sense that these orthodox theories can translate across different technologies. But then other things that are being done as part of this as well is looking at ways in which, let's say, events that are occurring within the context of the VR world can be translated into the physical work where the viewer is situated. So in this one simple example, maybe from about a year ago, Thomas had a chair, I modelled it in Blender, put it into the VR environment, and then we made people sit on it while they had the headsets on. And where there was any interaction with the chair, a vibration motor went off underneath the chair through a serial connection that was made, back to the chair or back to the motor. So this was the beginning of sort of exploring kind of ways in which how events or things or engagements that happened within the narrative environment of the VR would translate to change the visual space of the exhibition itself. We did a month-long residency together in Ireland there just over Easter, where we kind of explored some of these ideas, looking at ways in which, let's say, the things that people did in the VR had an impact on other content that was being generated on the fly and presented through multiple projectors within the space. So some examples there, and kind of, again, using kind of tools like, the usual Arduino, sort of working with Touch Designer as a way of kind of creating networks that are correspond between events that are happening in different media and how they can be corresponded with each other. So work that we're kind of doing at the minute is kind of reaching forward towards kind of establishing, let's say, exhibitions that, talk to each other, and, let's say the state of one artwork, once it can share its state across a network, can have an impact then, a narrative impact maybe, on other works that are connected to it. This is an example of some of the video work that Thomas was doing from Cape Clear, and one of the ideas that he developed was this notion that, let's say, in order to discover stories about the island, that you discover those by handling objects. We're looking at sort of casting a number of objects that have computer chips in them that correspond with touch designer, and then control the narratives that you have access to as part of the exhibition. So a lot of those latter examples of how there's a correspondence between let's say virtual or multimedia sort of environments, in different places, aren't very well supported, let's say, by orthodox theories, and there's really a requirement there to kind of bring in some resources from social studies and cognitive sciences to understand how we can talk about that. So thank you very much.